according to the rules of the American Psychiatric Association, if you're on LSD, you have a mental disorder. You're mentally ill while you're on the trip. It's officially defined that way.
Okay.
And, I mean, if you take a whole lot of it, you have a substance abuse problem. And LSD intoxication is a psychotic, deranged mental state, basically. Okay, well, so that's what I was taught. And nobody debated this. You didn't see professors stand up and say, yeah, but I took a lot of trips when I was a teenager and I'm okay.
Right.
It was this unanimous, and of course, lots of psychiatrists who are in their 50s and 60s now experimented with acid in the 60s.
Sure.
Personally.
Sure.
But everybody, don't talk about that. And
in fact, some incredible research came out of that and a lot of that got swept under the rug too.
Exactly. So then, while I'm reading all of this, I end up finding out the actual history of LSD, which again is completely public domain information. There's books on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the medical school library. It's not secret. And the real history is that it was really discovered by accident by this guy Albert Hoffman, who was a chemist at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland in 1943. And he was doing research on ergo-alkaloids, which are a chemical that grows in a specific type of fungus that grows on rye wheat.
Okay.
And so he just happens to be in that area and trying to see what are the properties of these things. He synthesizes some LSD, which is kind of a slightly modified version of this fungus. And he ingests some by accident and goes on the world's first LSD trip. And so then we fast forward to the 1960s when all of a sudden LSD is spilling out into the popular culture, right?
Right.
The question is, well, what happened in between?
Okay.
And so what happened in between was Sandoz started to manufacture LSD and was the first supplier and manufacturer of LSD in the world. And in the Bluebird documents from the early 50s, there's an internal CIA memo that says that this one CIA guy is talking to the other CIA guy saying he's concerned that the Soviets are trying to buy up the entire world's supply of LSD. Because they're using it for interrogation and brainwashing experiments.
Okay, so the parallel, at least there's some parallel research going on in the Soviet Union. Okay.
And so then the problem is, of course, if the Soviet Union buys all of the LSD, we won't have any for ourselves. Right. So then what the discussion is, we need a secure domestic supply, and who are the people who are experts on ergo-alkaloids, and who can we contract with? And lo and behold, in 1953, the first major manufacturer and distributor of LSD in the United States comes on the scene.
And who was that?
Well, who would it be? Some Colombians? Beatniks? Mafia? No, it's Eli Lilly Company.
You bet, Eli Lilly.
What? MKUltra subproject in 1953 for $400,000 was a CIA contract, top secret clearance contract with Eli Lilly to become the first major manufacturer and distributor of LSD in North America. And so they supplied then lots of LSD to the CIA and the military, which then was used in experiments. And some of the early people who first took LSD as subjects in military and CIA LSD experiments included Ken Kesey, Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary. This is how LSD actually got into our culture.
Right.
Is the subjects were recruited for mind control experimentation run by the CIA and the military.
Right.
And in these books that I then read, and articles and so on, I find that Joel Elkes, who was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, described in a radio interview, a TV interview, first taking LSD himself in 1947.
Wow.
So the head of the Department of Psychiatry at one of the major medical schools was able to get some LSD and take it himself in 1947.
Right.
20 years before the average hippie could take it.
Right.
And so the first people who took LSD in North America were actually CIA personnel and CIA contractor psychiatrists who used it recreationally themselves, gave it to their friends, colleagues, and sometimes spouses, and then started using it for therapy. So then there's a literature by the late 50s, early 60s, giving LSD to try and treat alcoholism, LSD to treat homosexuality, LSD to treat various neuroses. And when the government made LSD an illegal drug in '67 or so, there was a lot of protest from these LSD doctors that this was unscientific, it's against medicine, that LSD is a wonderful agent.
Right.
And so they'd been using it recreationally, giving it therapeutically to people, and also running mind control experimentation, brainwashing experiments.
Now, as a therapeutic, was it effective or?
Well, the studies were badly designed without proper controls and placebos and so on, most of them.
Mm-hmm.
But these guys were very enthusiastic about it and thought it was wonderful.
Right.
So in 1967, the people in psychiatry who knew the most about LSD were taking it themselves, using it as a therapeutic agent, and thought it was horrible, anti-scientific disaster that it was made illegal. 13 years later, in 1980, it was a mental disorder.
Incredible.
That's not science. That's a whole bunch of crazy politics.
Right, right. Yeah, I've heard stories from a friend of mine who was in Southern California at the time, in the late 60s, early 70s, and he tells stories about these cars with government license plates on them, with guys throwing sheets of paper out the windows of the cars that each had, you know, hundreds of hits of acid on them,
right.
And they would just throw them out the windows and let, you know, the kids or whoever was on the street just pick it up and do it. In fact, he says it was crazy. He said that they changed a whole generation and didn't even know it.
So the whole history of, and the same is true for mescaline and psilocybin,
Mm-hmm.
that came in through drug company suppliers and CIA military experimentation. That's how it got into our culture.
Were you
this
familiar?
is all, again, completely documented in medical journals.
Right. Were you familiar with Terence McKenna by chance?
Terence McKenna, I don't think so.
Yeah, he was a researcher into psilocybin. He's no longer with us. But in any case, go on.
So then that's one way that this whole sort of hidden but right out in public history has affected our culture as a whole. I mean, the whole 60s and turn on, tune in, drop out, and better living with chemistry.
Right.
That came from the CIA, the military, the government, the taxpayer, the major medical schools, chairman of departments of psychiatry.
Incredible.
That's who started all of that and got that ball rolling.
Absolutely incredible.
And then all of a sudden, within literally a decade and a half, it becomes a bunch of people with psychiatric disorders, substance abuse problems.
All right, well, let's talk about how that happened and what happened. What was the next sort of step in this pattern?
Well, one thing that's interesting but kind of macabre is that the LSD works on the brain neurotransmitter serotonin.
Correct.
So Eli Lilly first developed its expertise in serotonin pharmacology through studying LSD. That's how they got into the serotonin system, started finding out how it works, what the receptors are, and so on.
Right.
What's their main serotonin drug now? Prozac.
Prozac, exactly right.
So the motto of better living through chemistry is actually the motto of the American Psychiatric Association these days.
Yeah, it's just dressed up in some different clothes a little bit.
So what becomes a therapeutic agent that's prescribed by the doctor is a next door neighbor of what was 30 years ago the therapeutic agent prescribed by the doctor that also worked on serotonin, but that one got flipped into a dangerous street drug.
Right.
So there's a whole politics to all of this which it's not science at all. And it's all part of this kind of unorganized old boys network conspiracy of silence about how all of this happened and how it all developed.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example of that is the Manchurian Candidate.
All right. Well, I think that's another good opportunity to take a short break here. We'll come back with Dr. Colin Ross, and we will talk exactly about that, about the Manchurian Candidate, the so-called sleeper, and the mind control techniques that are used successfully to make that a reality. We'll be right back with Dr. Colin Ross, my guest tonight on Radio Orbit. We're talking about mind control and the U.S. government's involvement in the funding and research into mind control for many, many years. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. Colin Ross. Thanks for staying with us.